Based on real events, this is the unnerving life story of Carroll Edward Cole, a man who spent years telling doctors, police officers, friends, and even total strangers that he was dangerous, that he fantasized about strangling women, that he feared what he would become if no one stopped him. Most people laughed it off. Some filed a note and moved on. Others decided he was exaggerating or seeking attention. And in the space created by that collective dismissal, Cole became exactly what he said he would become. He warned everyone. No one listened. The result was a chain of deaths across the American West that might have been prevented. Carroll was born in 1938 in Sioux City, Iowa, into a home already listing under the weight of poverty and instability. His father, frequently absent for work, enforced discipline when he was present, but offered little warmth. His mother, Barbara, strict and outwardly pious, used shame as a tool. At times she dressed Carroll in girls' clothes to punish him and forced him to stand before neighbors like a spectacle. Humiliation became his language of love, a warped association that would shadow him for decades. He adored his older brother and craved approval, but learned early that affection in his house could be withdrawn as fast as it was given. School did not offer refuge. Carroll was small for his age and quick to anger. Teachers noted he had a sharp memory and a conspicuous ability to mimic adult phrases, but he bristled at authority and reacted badly to embarrassment. In the playground he oscillated between a shy child and a sudden bully. Some classmates later recalled an unnerving blankness that came over him when he felt cornered, a switch flipping off. What few people saw were the private rituals starting to form, fantasies of control, moments of cruelty toward animals, and the slow, secret rehearsal of violence in his imagination. He would later say those fantasies made him feel powerful, safe, and finally free from the humiliation that framed his childhood. At 13, according to Cole's own accounts, the fantasies matured into something darker. He began envisioning the act of strangulation, hands closing, breath stopping, absolute control. Around that same time a neighborhood boy died by drowning in an incident Carroll described as an accident. Investigators called it tragic and moved on. Whether that death was intentional has remained a subject of speculation, but for Cole it became a private milestone, a terrifying example of how easily a violent impulse could be washed away by a believable story and a boyish face. Adolescence fed the worst parts of him. He discovered alcohol early and used it like a key. Drink enough and the floodgates opened, drink a little more and the guilt blurred. By his late teens he was drifting between petty thefts, fistfights, and sudden bursts of rage. He enlisted in the military, seeking structure, but his service was brief and chaotic: disciplinary violations, theft, conflicts with superiors. Psychologists who evaluated him noted deep resentment toward women, poor impulse control, and a capacity for manipulation. Some reports explicitly warned he posed a danger if untreated. And still, after short institutional stays and paperwork that moved faster than his therapy, he was back on the street. The pattern that would define Cole's adult life took shape in the 1960s: a new city, a room for rent, days of drinking and odd jobs, nights in bars, a woman who was kind to him or teased him or simply reminded him of his mother, then a blackout, a body, and a hurried departure across state lines. He confessed more than once to police after violent incidents, telling them exactly what he was afraid of doing, sometimes claiming he had already done it. With no bodies located and witnesses describing him as an inebriated braggart, officers wrote it off. Doctors, too, heard his confessions. One psychiatrist recorded that Cole was a danger to women and recommended long-term confinement. The recommendation was not enforced. He signed himself out, or the bed was needed for someone deemed more urgent, or the legal threshold for commitment was not met. The door swung open. He walked through. By 1971, the murders were no longer hypothetical. In San Diego, he strangled a woman he had met after a night of drinking. He woke with shaking hands and a hollow calm, told himself it could never happen again, then repeated the behavior with another woman a few weeks later. Alcohol loosened his restraints. Humiliation, real or imagined, pulled the trigger. The victims, most often women he encountered in bars or cheap hotels, were found in cars, alleys, and isolated rooms. When questioned about motive, Cole's answers were chilling and consistent. He felt mocked, he felt small, he felt like a child in his mother's hands, and then he felt nothing at all. He married more than once, and each marriage burned with the same volatile fuel: jealousy, drinking, sudden violence, remorse, promises. Partners described the whiplash of his moods, the way a minor slight could become a storm. Some reported that he insisted on wrapping his hands around their throats during intimacy, others spoke of apologies followed by days of quiet before the cycle began again. Police were called. Reports were made. Sometimes he spent a night in jail. More often, he was released with a warning. He told officers, "I'm dangerous. I'm telling you so you can stop me." The words went into the file. The door opened again. Through the mid-1970s, Cole moved among Nevada, Texas, and California, leaving behind a fog of rumors and unexplained deaths. Victim counts vary depending on the jurisdiction, the year, and which of Cole's own confessions one believes, but a conservative estimate places the number at 13. Investigators who worked the cases privately suspected more. The method rarely changed: alcohol, accusation or perceived insult, hands to the throat, a calm that followed like a falling curtain. In interviews after his arrest, Cole said the calm was the point, a temporary silence in his head, a brief erasure of the constant replay of childhood shame. He linked nearly everything to his mother, as if every woman who crossed his path was drafted into the role of an old tormentor. In 1980 the violence turned inward to the person closest to him. During a period of escalating fights and heavy drinking, Cole strangled his wife, Diana. He later framed it as a symbolic act, a grotesque attempt to kill the mother figure he could not escape. By then, local police already knew his history, past partners had warned them, doctors had documented the danger. The question that echoes through the case is not whether anyone saw the risk, but why the alarms did not translate into lasting protection for the women around him. A patchwork of jurisdictions, overburdened hospitals, narrow commitment laws, and the stigma around mental health combined to create the perfect blind spot, and Cole lived in that blind spot. His final arrest began like so many turning points, with an ordinary encounter that became fatal. In the latter months of 1980, after a string of killings across state lines, he was taken into custody in Nevada. The interrogation that followed is among the most unnerving on record. Calm, sober, almost relieved, Cole laid out a travelogue of death. He named cities. He described patterns. He admitted to killing again and again, sometimes forgetting names but rarely forgetting the feeling, the instant when the anger evaporated into quiet. Detectives noted that he did not gloat, he did not cry. He explained. As if finally, after years of shouting into the wind, someone had turned to face him and said, "We're listening." The legal path from confession to conviction was not simple. Different states claimed jurisdiction over different murders. Defense experts argued that Cole's childhood trauma and chronic alcoholism had fractured his judgment beyond repair. Prosecutors countered that he demonstrated planning, awareness, and flight, the hallmarks of responsibility under the law. In court, survivors and families described the women he had taken: kind, sharp, brave, funny, whole lives with edges and light. Cole rarely looked up. When he spoke, he acknowledged what he had done with a kind of clinical detachment. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for it to be over. The verdicts came quickly. The sentence, ultimately, was death. On December 6, 1985, at Nevada State Prison, Carroll Edward Cole was executed by lethal injection. Witnesses described him as composed, almost formal, as if he had slipped back into the discipline he never truly had. Accounts of his last statement vary in wording, but the meaning was plain: he felt little for the people he killed and carried one unspent hatred he could not bury, his mother. It was a final, grim confirmation that the private war of his childhood had become a public catastrophe. The questions his case leaves behind are not academic. How many opportunities did institutions have to interrupt his trajectory? What legal thresholds prevented doctors from holding him when their notes screamed danger? How much did the stigma of addiction and mental illness dull the urgency of the risk he presented? And what training or protocols, had they existed then, might have flagged him as a serial offender long before the body count mounted? Cole's life sits at the intersection of personal pathology and systemic failure. He is responsible for his choices. Systems are responsible for theirs. Criminal psychologists often cite the case to illustrate how humiliation, attachment wounds, and misogynistic belief systems can fuse into lethal behavior, especially when reinforced by substance abuse and opportunity. But they also cite it to argue for integrated responses, cross-state data sharing, clearer standards for involuntary treatment when immediate risk is present, and a default posture of taking explicit violent ideation seriously, even when the speaker is intoxicated. If a man tells you he wants to strangle women, believe him. If he tells you twice, act. For the families of the women Cole killed, academic lessons offer little comfort. Their lives split on their lost dates, birthdays and holidays became hard rooms to enter. Some have spoken publicly, turning their grief outward in the hope that awareness saves others. Others chose silence. What unites them is an absence that does not shrink with time, and the anger that the warnings were there, spoken in plain language, long before the funerals. Today, the story of Carroll Edward Cole circulates in documentaries, court archives, and classrooms. It is retold not to grant him infamy, but to underline a brutal truth: sometimes evil does announce itself. Sometimes the monster knocks on the door wearing its own name tag. The tragedy is not only that he killed. It is that he begged to be stopped and walked away anyway. A failure of empathy, a failure of systems, and a failure of imagination, to picture exactly what a man might do when he tells you who he is. This is the legacy of Carroll Edward Cole, a childhood carved by humiliation, a manhood animated by alcohol and rage, a trail of deaths that might have been shortened by a single decisive intervention. He warned them. He warned us. And in the hollow between his warnings and our response, lives were taken. Remember the names of the women. Remember the lessons. And when the next warning comes, because it will, do not look away.